Okay, hello and welcome back to Heads and Tails. My name's Henry Faber. I'm one of the co-founders at Opperden, and I'm absolutely thrilled this week to have Jodh Dhesi with me, who is CEO of the King Edward VI Foundation, otherwise known as KEVI, in Birmingham. And I know that Jodh spent 14 very successful years at Parkside Federation Academies. He's a modern linguist, which we share in common. I was never a head of modern foreign languages, but I'm certainly interested in languages. And successive, really interesting promotions took him to head teacher and various bits of school leadership and an outstanding Ofsted inspection in 2017. And I think I'm right in saying it was 2019 when Jodh moved to the UAE, big move, I imagine, and climbed the ranks at GEMS through the Indian schools and then the UAE schools, being responsible for 46 of them, I think I'm right in saying, before eventually finding his way to Deputy CEO for the GEMS Education Group in general, with strategic educational oversight for all those schools in the UAE, Qatar and Saudi. Now tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it's then that you head not so long after back to the UK, closer to home to KEVI, and you've been there since 2020. So Jodh, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for sharing the time.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here today.
Good. Okay, so I've got a few questions. And as you know, at Opperden, we're obsessed with all things mentoring. So it stands to start with a mentoring question. Did you have a formal mentor? Do you have a formal mentor? I'd love anything on your perspective on mentoring, really.
I've been really lucky through my career to work with some inspirational leaders who I've certainly taken as much as I can from. So in that sense, I've had a number of mentors. I've also had, at times, professional coaches that I've found extremely useful. And they've always come at exactly the right time, I've found, when something's been particularly challenging. But if I had to identify one individual, there is someone with whom I worked for around 14, 15 years, as you said, at Parkside in Cambridge. And he was the leader of the organization. He was the head teacher, first of all, of the school. And as that school grew, he became the executive principal of the federation and the CEO of the MAT. And I learned a huge amount from him. First of all, he was incredibly creative and innovative and divergent. And they're possibly not my strengths. I'm more of a systematic person, marshalling resources, marshalling people. So in that sense, he was a wonderful person to have as a mentor, to try to inspire me to be more creative. He also was fantastic at seeing opportunities. I just mentioned the different roles that he did, principal executive, principal CEO. So he was the leader of one of the first federations of schools, one of the first small MATs schools. He set up an international baccalaureate sixth form for a state school, which is very unusual. So he really, really could see and seize opportunities. And the third thing is that he absolutely saw the potential in people. And so I was one of a number of really quite young professionals whom he promoted into middle leadership roles and then senior leadership roles. He took a risk. He made me head of department in my second year of teaching. He was willing to accept my mistakes, etc. And really was that seeing potential in developing me and others that I really took as something to aspire to. And I genuinely don't think I would be here now doing this role at the period in my career that I am, had I not been in a school that was led by him.
I'm sure that's it seems to me, a very modest appraisal of your own growth and kind of experience going through schools. But I love that idea about timing and I guess being very proactive in taking that mentorship too. I'm sure it wasn't a one-way stream. I'm sure you asked the right questions at the right times. What about if we head a little further back into time gone by, into history, your own experiences of school? You've now run a great many schools and led, and all the rest of it. What about your own time at school? Maybe there's an anecdote or an experience to share, perhaps to showcase a little of what Jodh the teenager was like.
Well, I was incredibly lucky, I feel, with my education. I had a transformational education. My parents were both absolutely committed to learning. We had books everywhere at home, but they both left school at 16. And it was my older sister who was the trailblazer, the first in our generation to go to university. I was very lucky. I went to a grammar school in Essex, and I had some really, really supportive teachers there. And I remember one particular evening, it was in year 9, and I went with my mum to the parents' evening, and we were talking about the subjects I might do and also the tiers that I might do. And I was wanted to play it safe. I thought, I was worried about, you have that cliff edge where if you don't get a B, you drop off and you get a U and you get old money. I was really worried about this. So my mother and I said to the deputy head who we were talking to, well, we think Jodh ought to do foundation science. And he sort of looked at us and he said, you do know that he's one of our Oxbridge hopefuls? And actually, we didn't know that. And we were both, oh, really? And from that moment, he said, of course, he should be doing higher. And he steered me to do challenging GCSEs and A-levels. And in the end, I was really lucky and I did get to go to Christ's at Cambridge. But I think without him and without that moment and that push to say, you do know you can do this. Again, I think with that sort of working class doubt that one sometimes has, that playing it safe, I might not have done the correct subjects, the correct tiers, and might not have been able, again, to progress. He was a very dynamic person and he really, really supportive.
Perhaps a rhetorical question rather than a really difficult grenade of a question, but how do we make that experience that you've just described possible for every student for whom that's the case, and not for it to be a fortunate, not mishap, but a fortunate piece of, coincidence that happened for you? I think it's a really, really special story, actually, that I'm sure chimes with a lot of student and teacher experiences. And I'm sure probably part of the fabric of your DNA in a way, in terms of how you look to run institutions and enable those kind of opportunities for young people. Would that be fair?
The social mobility part is incredibly important to me. And at the foundation in our work now, we have three really key pillars towards that. One is working with comprehensive schools that served very, very disadvantaged areas. The other is our grammar school admissions, which means we've got over 20% of children in our grammar schools from disadvantaged backgrounds. And the others is a very large assisted places stroke bursary scheme for our independent schools. And I wouldn't be here if I hadn't been absolutely convinced that the governors of our organisation feel as strongly as I do about social mobility and high expectations and ambition for children from all backgrounds.
And what about along that career? I'm sure it's not always been plain sailing, perhaps the odd checkered moment. Have there been any standout toughest moments, perhaps good challenges that have been overcome?
I think as a head, it's amazing the things that you deal with. I think drugs and stabbings and fights and challenging parents, inspection mishaps, redundancies, student recruitment issues. I mean, there's many lists. I know colleagues will encounter those day to day and will do so in the future. I think the biggest dilemma I faced was actually when I was a pastoral leader. It was when I was the head of sixth form of the new sixth form that I mentioned earlier, the IB sixth form in Cambridge. And I was the designated person for the sixth form. And it just struck me how, whereas as when I was a curriculum leader, head of department and working on those things could be very structured. You could deal with things very easily. In the pastoral side of things just emerge that you haven't planned for. And very often there isn't an answer. And sometimes there are incredibly challenging things. Like I remember a sixth form girl coming in, telling me, disclosing that her mother was the victim of domestic violence. So I subsequently met the mother, obviously primary thing being to check whether the student was also subject to this, and talking to her and realizing that I couldn't actually do much. I tried to persuade her to go to the police and all sorts. And I think that was a really challenging time, dealing with those pastoral issues, phoning up social services, telling them the age of the student, and then clearly having to prioritize 5-year-olds who are having challenges. So I think probably the toughest moments in my career were those pastoral issues where you realize that unlike a question of pedagogy or assessment or curriculum where there is an answer, sometimes there isn't an easy answer. And then it's just a case of trying to be really supportive morally to children and to their parents.
I suppose there must be a frustrating conflict between the school or the school leader's ability to be a leader in the community or to be responsible for a community or the people therein, with the limitations of what happens outside of the school gates not officially being a responsibility. It's a kind of a complex brief where I suppose there's a catch-22 of what you can and can't change, and I suppose accepting that must be a complex piece of being an educator. To brighter themes, maybe a best moment. Has there been an absolute epiphany or an Everest that's been climbed that particularly comes to mind?
I think something that I'd be tempted to say was, I always, as a head of department, as well as teaching a range of students, always like to take bottom sets at Key Stage 4 to try to really, really push those students. And I remember there was one results day, and this Year 11 boy came up to me, and he'd been a bit of a challenge. And he said to me, "I got a C in French." "Oh, delighted. He said, "I didn't get the others." But he was so pleased that he got that, and he deliberately came and found me to tell him that he got that C. So there are moments like that. I think in my current role, though, it's actually something that happened just a month ago. We had an inspection of one of our schools, an Ofsted inspection, and by no means is everything about Ofsted, but this was a really significant moment because this school is the second most deprived mainstream school in the country. 75% children entitled to free school meals, left behind part of the country, white working class children who really haven't had an investment in them. And it joined our trust 4 years ago. It had $1.5 million cumulative deficit. Children weren't coming to the school. Big issues. And that school leadership and those teachers and the wider trust and foundation have worked really, really hard. And it went from inadequate to good last month as a school. Now, as I say, Ofsted isn't the be-all and end-all, and ratings aren't important per se, but for that community to say that they have a good school and those children go to a good school after 18 years of not having one is incredibly important. And it's given the school a lift and a pride, which means that those children are just so happy that this has happened to their school. So it probably is. I know it's very recent, and maybe recent things are more in your memory, but that feels like a hugely important moment for them and for us as an organisation.
I can only compare in the sense that from running a micro organisation compared to a much larger, more complex one like you do, the strategic or systemic moments of change like that feel big and powerful and exciting, no matter how big or small a part you've had to play in them. And I guess there's then that feeling of, right, on to the next, what happens tomorrow? And you leave that mini moment behind in the dust and focus on what's coming next. We have an audience of educationalists who no doubt ingest, digest, enjoy all sorts of great content. So I'm always keen to dig under the surface with content. Are you a big reader? You alluded to all those books around you as a child, maybe films, podcasts, anything you'd be happy to openly recommend and get our audience excited about?
Yes, well, it's not an educational journal and it's not educational per se, but for me, it's an example of how powerful a book can be in educating somebody and then influencing the way that they appreciate something. So it's actually a book that was written in 1950, and it's by someone called Ernst Gombrich, and he wrote a book called The Story of Art. And it's a magisterial description of the history of art, right back to the very first paintings in caves in southern France through to what was then the modern day, which was 1950. And he explained to me, as I think I was in my early 20s when I read it, so much more about visual arts than I knew. I'd done art GCSE not particularly well, and I liked painting and things, but absolutely he explained the history and the context and the craftsmanship and all those things, which then meant that I knew much, much more about it. And this is the important bit, I was really able to appreciate art so much more. So for me, that is just an incredible book. And I think that we must never underestimate that what one tome can do in terms of taking someone's knowledge, but also catapulting them into being able to appreciate, in this case, culture, but it could be something else, to a much, much greater degree, and to give them a lifetime enjoyment of that particular area that was described.
Thank you. That's a lovely recommendation. And can I ask, in Easter holidays upcoming, or even during the term time, are you able to read? Do you have the time? Are you a voracious reader? Are you listening to things in the car on the way to work? How do you get your content these days?
Yeah, I still absolutely love reading, and so whatever time it is that I go to bed, I make sure I've got a half an hour or 45 minutes before switching off the light to really, really sit down and read. And I've got young children, so yeah, I don't have a huge amount of time at weekends and evenings, but that I do carve out some to read, and it's a mixture of sometimes it's professional things. I'm doing an MBA at the moment, so I'm doing a lot of reading around the more business side of things, because obviously my role, while still absolutely focused on education, now has that strategic and financial and operational element to it. But I love a good novel, and I do love history books as well. So I'm currently reading History of Paris, which is tremendously well written.
Lovely. I mean, if you're anything like me, you're struggling to stay awake for those 30 minutes before bed with the book in hand. That's my problem. And I don't have young children. So I dread to think how you're surviving. But great to hear such an encouraging story that you're continuing to educate yourself so much. And that MBA sounds fascinating. We might have to check in on a future series on that. An interesting one for you. Perhaps there is, I mean, I feel like education is surrounded by controversial opinions or slightly divisive topics. I don't want to poke under the surface too much, but perhaps there's an unpopular or controversial opinion you're proud enough of, or kind of open enough to share. Be interested to hear what you come up with for that.
Well, I think the very organisation that I work in lends itself potentially to controversy because we have independent schools, which are very much in the news at the moment. We have grammar schools, of which there are only 163 left, and cause very strong opinions in some people, and we're trying to get those three sets of schools, along with the comprehensive, to work together. So that in itself, I think, is potentially controversial. Some people have said to me, well, how can you get those schools to work? What difference will it make? Well, the story I told you earlier about our school improving, I think, is very much down to being in a group of schools. But I've got quite a younger sister, and she sometimes calls me a centrist dad, which I understand is a term. So I was reflecting on that the other day when she called me it. And I think, for me, being a centrist dad, maybe the accumulation of opinions aren't particularly controversial, but it seems to be that when they're put together, it turns into something which is being the centrist dad. But I mean, probably those two things aside, the thing that really gets me is about inherited privilege, which prevents others from being able to fulfill their potential. And that we find enshrined in our constitution, in our setup, in the way that things work. So that's why I'm so committed to social mobility. And that probably is potentially one of my controversial things that I think that we really need to level our society.
I don't think that's controversial. I think that's admirable. But I think you are clearly at the hub or at the center of an interesting conflagration of different ideas and opinions, just in terms of the variety of schools you're working with. But I think you're proving that partnership is powerful, and that's, I think we're not seeing enough of that. Too much of a deficit model, not enough of a how can we work together and support one another to better everyone. So thank you. That's a really interesting thing to have shared. And last but not least, perhaps a piece of advice, or a few pieces of advice, or whatever you're happy to share for those kind of crawling their way up the ranks in the sector, interested in staying in education and schools. What have you learned over the years that is your must-have piece of advice to share?
Well, I think stick with it, because I know at the moment there's all this talk about retention and people leaving the profession. So stick with it. It is a wonderful, wonderful profession, working with young people. And as you progress, having the opportunity to influence more young people's lives is incredibly, incredibly rewarding. I'd say work hard. People notice that. Obviously be mindful of yourself and all that sort of stuff, but do work hard. Be resilient. If things don't go your way, don't blame others. Think about, how could I have made that situation better? If you don't get a job, don't say, well, it was a panel, it was fixed. Say, what could I do to really convince them even more? And I'd say put yourself forward when opportunities arise. If you think you've got a chance, why not just go for it? And you might not get it, but it's worth a go, provided that you feel that you have done enough in what you're doing before. So I know you look at my CV, you might think, oh gosh, he's moved on to various things. But within organizations, I've always built on what I've done. And the next job has been very much built on the foundations of the other things. So I would say stick with it, go for it, and enjoy it. Try and have fun. Take time to have a good time with your colleagues. And if you can, go out after work. Obviously, that comes a bit more difficult maybe when you're in more senior roles, but just enjoy the moment, because it's a wonderful sector to be working in.
Lots of really lovely nuggets of wisdom and advice there, so thank you very much. I am personally, and I know that other people will feel the same, very excited to see not just what next for Kevi as an organisation, but for you. And I really appreciate you sharing the time you have done with some really lovely, pithy, very eloquently put pieces of wisdom. So thank you for sharing the time, Jodh, and good luck for a very restful Easter holiday, if you're allowed that as an SLT.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk today.
Thank you.